Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome to Day 6, Hour 5 of this Nebulous live development creation series here on YouTube. I am moving forward with the UI system. I have a lot of minor adjustments to think about for the scanning system and the spawning system. One second. Excuse me. I've also got to invest in... I've also got the groundwork laid out for celestial infrastructure. I'm going to need better random placement, or I'm going to need ships that can do stuff. And that kind of winds up wiggling into orbital structures that can do stuff. The only other thing to do, which is necessary but more of a can kick, is research, which is more or less this same philosophy over here. Title value, investability. So it's just you name the research, you have the value, and then the investability. And for whichever values are in here, the player can start to research them. And at the moment, there's only a few things that are actually affectable, but that would be another system I could build. There's also this info system, which might come in handy at some point. Otherwise, it's the spawning system. Has to get a little better. That way the player has a lot more to scan each time the game loads. And then they're going to have ships to deal with whatever they find. And then they can do research investment as time goes by. And then the idea would be to also have the priority selector set up somehow for delegating where ships need to prioritize their attention. And for that there will have to be extra infrastructure options. Set up orbital build will need to be there for most likely creating orbital So I've had two ideas for this. One was to have no orbital structures and instead put everything that an orbital structure would do, just put it on the planet, so that the planet would have the capacity to build ships that would just like launch off the planet. And the planet would have the capacity to put up its own shield, and the planet would have the capacity to like shoot missiles or something. You could effectively arm the planet itself, and you wouldn't have to deal with orbital structures. So that is one design option. Another design option is to keep the orbital structures, but then you're getting into placing them. So does the player get to place them in a specific location, or do they randomly spawn? Sort of turns into something like that. So if you have to decide on something like this, it might actually be kind of cool if the ships launched off the planet. Or more or less they would... That's the idea, is they would launch off the planet, but they might... It still makes sense to use shipyard. I mean, lorically speaking, the shipyard means that the ship doesn't have to be able to leave atmospheric orbit and fly in space, so it's like... It makes sense that there's a shipyard in space. It also makes sense that there's a trade hub in space, so... Sorry, I'm just considering what to do here. I will also have to do 3D models for the orbitals, which is another reason why it would be nifty to just use the planet. And that would allow expansion into those systems without needing to do the 3D model code for the structures. So I could get some ship flow. Well, that's going to require the ship, to some extent, the ship designer and the ship fleet. So I apologize. There just happened to be a bunch of design decisions here that I've got to think about. Like, what does the fleet window actually do? The fleet section can... The idea is it lists multiple fleets. And perhaps has a few other things in there, like a trade fleet or something, I'm not sure. Something I still have to figure out exactly how I want to do. Priority sector kind of makes sense because, like, it's very similar to the scanning system. You just sort of designate an area as the priority, and you chop up the area if you need to split it up or whatever. Otherwise, I have to come up with 3D models for the ships and stuff, and I'm trying to avoid with doing that for the moment, just for the sake of more prototyping. So, like, primitive ships that just come off of the planet, which can eventually just come off of the orbital if need be, will be set to orbit the planet. If no priority is selected, or if its priority selector is, or if the priority selector is engaged, then depending on the travel capabilities of the ships can in fact move into action automatically, is the idea. So essentially the player would build some economy, scan out, and then build maybe a warp drive scanner claimer with maybe like subspeed or with like subspace thrusters for moving around, but essentially a specialized scanner claimer thing if the player chooses to go that route. And essentially the priority will set that ship to investigate the Celestial. If Celestial is claimable, start to claim it, and then if it needs to be scanned more, scan it, and it can like scan and claim it more or less, and like as multiple ships flow to that target, that increases the scanning and claiming essentially. So the player can decide how they want their ships to function in that regard. And then as the player's scanning finds more stuff, then they can start to spread out their ships to cover more ground, kind of thing. And as they discover certain resources, they are able to then get like cargo ships to come and grab the stuff. And it all basically automates, because the cargo ships understand what is within their capacity, which is essentially lanes with some kind of resource they can carry back to the planet. Just going to take some ships, like some ship models. So we have to consider how to do that. And my idea is to use prefabs for a little while. And I could just use the planet for now. Skip the designer system. Make a couple prefab ships with intentional capacities. And then use those 3 ships as a exemplar of the ships doing stuff. And then from there, like, the game has scanning, claiming, infrastructure bonuses, slight ship investment and ship activity, and then designation with the priority selector, and then arguably some research options for investment. And from there, the player can, or at the moment, at that point anyway, the player will have like 3 ships to choose from. And the priority system can, in fact, kind of figure out what, and this might be something that's kicked down to the leadership tier, but essentially the player can choose every single ship and micromanage as much as they want, or they can start to invest in the leadership route. And that starts to intelligently do some of the micromanaging for the player. So if they got to a point where they hired the like military leader, the leader would more or less get a read on the situation and tell you the mathematical best course of option as accurately as their skills and investment will allow them to. And they can even automate some of the process. And then the priority sector could like understand that they're like where the pressure's at, or where it's safe to grab resources and stuff like that. And then from there, it's like, it really comes down to what kind of things can the player discover for scanning higher frequencies, and then what does it feel like to to meet resistance in the game space, which is more or less the diplomacy route, where the player, through high discovery, finds other factions that are friendly or not and has to deal with them. And the diplomacy investment more or less makes dealing with that entity easier, is the idea. Or it sort of arms your leaders with more information, or arms the player with more information. Or there's also positive aspects of diplomacy where the player can negotiate like information agreements. They can negotiate scan result sharing. They can negotiate possibly the main thing would be trade routes. So there's some kind of resource that both of the factions have that the other needs some of, so they can negotiate a trade route, and they actually each have to physically trade the materials to the other player. And this is something that comes down to diplomacy for negotiating trade values and for like negotiating travel through the space for cargo ships. And it kind of implores players of this style to more or less it also allows the players to not have to focus on that particular neighbor as a priority, and they can flow all of their ships to like some other problem. And if they have if they have like high standings with each other, they don't have to worry about each other attacking. So it's a safe bet they can push other places, and also like if the situation calls for it, maybe they can escort their trade ships, depending on the nature of their neighbors. But there are options in the diplomacy tab to actually leverage I'm missing the words here, but it would allow you to leverage your neighbors, more or less. You don't have to conquer them. You can go down the conquer route if you want to. If you build enough ships and you can push down to their planets and start conquering their planets, then they lose that economy. And the idea is that you could feasibly conquer the entity also. So there are options like that as well. And so the diplomacy tab will assist in providing the context of resistance in the game. You wind up meeting the resistance in other empires. And depending on their style of play, or not necessarily their style of play, but depending on whatever style the simulation is running on them, the player has to kind of determine this through micromanagement or through some delegation. And then the player effectively has the options to meet the moment as necessary. And that would be a solid spot to get the game to, without needing to make any 3D models or mess around with any shaders. If I can get that entire concept situated, I think the game would prototypically speaking be pretty far along. And it would, a lot of the rest of it is like comes down to cosmetic concerns and a few balancing implications, but I suppose that's probably a good shot to aim for. Because there is a lot more after that, even where like being able to fly a ship or whatever is still on there on the list of things to do. Having the galaxy be made up of nebula, but all of the nebula like connect throughout the arms. So an arm might be made up of 5 or 6 nebula, and they each are interconnected. And the idea is that each nebula has star pockets, and they have like the main star lane that goes through them to the end of the galactic arm. And essentially within these star pockets there are star clusters and star systems. So the idea is that if the player spawns in a nebula like this, they may be close in space to another star system, but if they're on the border of a nebula, then there might be a nebulonic cloud in the way, which would effectively act as a wall, and it could effectively create a little bit more environment for the player, because then what I can do is generate the nebula as a skybox. So that way if the player is inside of the whichever nebula or star system they're in, will have a skybox of their surrounding nebula, more or less. And then that kind of gives them a way to scan down stuff inside of their nebulous, or inside of their nebula, because they understand that there's only stars in like certain directions, and they might be able to help them out in that regard. The problem though with going down this route of using the nebula like this is that it opens up the game to use 3D space more literally. So there might be a nebula that have stars in the up direction. However, the scanning system right now is locked to 2 dimensions. If I do the nebula thing and then there's 3 dimensions, that's going to change the scanning system just a little bit. Which I have an idea for doing that, but the scan will still act the same way, as long as I get the math correct. However, that will also require the scanning, or that require the random spawning system to be able to place stars or place objects in general at different elevations in 3D space and not lock it to 2D, to a 2D plane for spawning. So that'll be something that'll have to be worked on and tested and balanced and fiddled around with, but that will be important for star systems that will feel a little better than how the default system I've got now, with how it's like the main planet's like right next to the sun. The idea is to have the random spawn it a little further away, and proximity to the sun like kind of makes it look bigger. So there's like a bunch of specifics I have to deal with for that, which ties into the ship system anyway, because the ships have to fly around in space too. So I've got to like get the ship's prefabs set up. If the ship's small enough, there will just be a UI element, so I might have to do some UI element spawning as well. for a fleet. And that will allow the fleet to be the only quote-unquote game object, and I can let data represent multiple ships, if necessary. And that can shift... that can shift to multiple zones and sectors, multiple priority zones, splitting up the fleet. If I decided to cover more ground all of a sudden, or if I decided to go back to, or if I decided to focus and concentrate on a spot in particular. And then the scans would reveal different stuff, which would require different ships. So if it's a tiny signature, the planet could scan it, but there's also the potential to send a ship out there. And the ship could actually use a much lower range and lower arc and but higher frequency scan, and just do like a local scan. So there could be ways to more cost effectively scan stuff like that using local ships. But that requires the ship to have warp drive and a scanner, and then it doesn't have any weapons, so then it depends on what shows up, what winds up being there at the scan. So I'm just kind of formulating all of my ideas real quick, because there's still a lot to do, and I've got to make sure that I note everything I want to make before I pin down some of the stuff. Because essentially, if I can find interesting, if the player can find interesting things through scanning, whether that be more economy or whatever higher frequency scans yield, which typically could yield something. I guess it really depends on the signature. That's something that has to go through a lot of balance consideration. But whatever they're discovering is a very, very key dynamic to any expansion or combat that they will be doing, or diplomacy for that matter, because the scanner could effectively scan down a lot of different stuff. And could essentially find a resource through that diligence of scanning. Or they could find a lot of other things. But it breaks the procedural nature if I start to get like really specific on what the things are. So if there's some way that ideally there would be some way that the scanning element, or a celestial, there has to be some way that the celestial, being a lower level scanning signature, requires a higher frequency to scan, or there is a large celestial that is easy to scan down but has more discoveries at different tiers of scanning. So kind of what just came to mind was that upon random spawn, upon random generation, each celestial actually gets a tier value for like how many tiers of discovery it has, and like the max frequency required for that. So essentially, it could have like 4 that are each not too much investment, or it could have like 8 where like it starts to get pretty high near the end for how much they cost to scan. And that would be a way to diversify how scanning can produce resource. It can do further discovery on planets, or it can make more interesting discoveries with higher frequency scans on tough to scan down sites. But I just don't know exactly what would be within those. Because whatever it is, it starts to get like very lorical, and that is tricky for the procedural nature of the game. Especially if the player is like always looking for something in the game. So I'm not sure how to balance this out necessarily. If I can find some funding for this, it would be easy to get some help for some of that kind of lyrical stuff. So let's see what happens as I keep working on this. Alright, so I'm still trying to consider how I should approach this particular issue. It'll kind of come down to random spawning differences. It makes sense that they could reveal more resource. That'll make sense. And then it comes down to balancing higher level discovery, or like intersystem discovery and internebula discovery, with like meeting NPC empires, major or minor factions. And dealing with the pressures that they emerge onto the game. Which the player meets by building up their empire, and it will come down to how they manage everything and how they invest, which, just like other strategy games, comes down to how you build. And essentially they'll have the option to do that, to build an empire. And flow an empire which is a little different than other games I've seen, I think. I haven't played every single game out there, but I'm hoping that will just be different from other games. Plus, if I can get the exploration system a little bit more interesting, it will actually be, there will be curious instances from whatever randomness spawns in the systems. I just don't have any great ideas for that at the moment. And after that, it would be like polishing the UI and making the shaders really good. Doing some maybe some Cinemachine stuff. Being able to jump on a ship and like third person control the ship, which starts to get into graphics. And then also like accurate fleets starts to get into more efficiency issues where you might have like 100 ships on grid or something. Outside of some of that technical graphics stuff, though, and outside of like the ship designer idea, and then like breaking up the resource system from one, instead of just one credit, or instead of just one money value, quote unquote, there would be figure out a way to break up the resource system into like some kind of or break it up into multiple resources. The main thing that comes to mind, of course, is like minerals, but that's what everybody else does. And then like you could go with gas clouds, but that's not very original either. So it's like I was trying to consider maybe some compounds. Like maybe you can get the minerals and then also get the gases and then synthesize those. And then you can actually wind up with higher tier compounds that actually can buff multiple things, and then you can mix and match the compounds. That would be more interesting than just only getting raw economy. So that's something I have to consider. As a strategy game, I think it would work. Or it would work well enough, I think, to get more funding for more help from like a publisher or something. Because it would be cool to do even more stuff, but I don't have the skills to do the humanoid stuff all the way. Like, it would be cool to have like a story mode, but that would require a lot of extra stuff. So I'm kind of skipping that part for now. And I'm going more for just the strategy element of the game. And the closest thing to like a roleplay would be the singular ship, one gigantic singular ship. Which still sounds a little kind of fun to do. Because in a game like Solaris, you can't just get like one gigantic ship. The ships are split up over the supply capacity to such a degree that it's hard to feel like you have like a super ship in that game. Alright, so I guess at this point, if I'm going to keep this ball rolling, I need to double check that all of these scanning parameters are updating correctly that I've hooked up. And something I need to do is, now that I'm taking a look at this, so if I invest this and this, it's a little weird how fast it's going. And that's because of the parallelism slowing it down. So it is in fact acting as if this one's in there. It might not be updating properly. If I clear them both, and then deselect and reselect, so that says the frequency is up to 15. So I can do an 18 range scan, and I can't even afford it. If I super drop this, I can barely afford it, but then as I start to jack up this frequency this high, it's gonna go way down, but and that's essentially how that works. So the player can't just rush frequency too quickly. it's with how I have it scaled, it's not cheap. I'm just not sure how to convey that to the player off the top. Because if they do something like this, then they're going to have all this frequency that they can't afford. Even at like extremely short values. I mean, it's pretty short. And that one is so fast that it didn't even show up on the screen, looks like. Or it might not be coloring correctly, I'm not sure. It's just going pretty quick. So if we go up to 7. It's like the magenta color. If we go up to 8. Oh, it's turning black for some reason. And I think I understand why that is. So I'll have to fix that. But at the get-go, this kind of thing is still possible where a long-range scan wave can be shot for a cheaper price. So this phenomenon still exists, and look at that, it made a discovery. If the player was interested in doing the scans like this. So it's almost correct, except for this needs to update properly. And let me double check if this is updating properly. So they just need to be managed properly. Therefore we will, I'm pretty sure it's pretty close in the code to what we were just working on. So we jump in here. So the economy value. So down here it would be the same thing. So let me double check in the UI builder what I named these. So this one was, yes, and this is what I'm naming it. Or this is what I'm messing with. Active selection scanning frequency value. So label active selection scanning frequency value. More or less we can copy this. Excuse me. And set it up as this. So now I have this label. And we very simply have to update the label every time. Which in this instance it actually isn't updating, is it? Or maybe it's updating down here, no. Oh, maybe what I did was I ran this in the iterator. And yeah, so we're essentially just mimicking this model here, where we said float active selection scanning frequency infrastructure value is player data's current active selection. Whoops, that's incorrect. And we're getting a component off of it for scanning frequency infrastructure. We're grabbing that value as this float, and then we are checking if that float has changed and active selection previous scanning frequency infrastructure. Okay, so this is not equal to active selection scanning frequency infrastructure value. And then we need to basically grab this. I'm gonna yank it out of here, and then I never used this label either, so I'm gonna yank it out of here too. And then So active selection scanning frequency value. Dot text equals active selection scanning frequency infrastructure value. That to string. And we also need to assign player data's active selection previous scanning frequency infrastructure. So active selection scanning frequency okay, I think that's correct. Now it has to equal the active selection scanning frequency infrastructure value. This will accurately update the value. It will update the text readout value, and it will update the previous value as the new value. And as it's a frequency, I should just grab the slider while I'm at it as well. And I think this was very likely just called this. And it's just active scanning frequency. So then we have to query the root for a slider, and it's called active scanning frequency. And that slider has a max value or a high value that needs to equal ASSFIV. And we also need one more label. And to keep this consistent, this is down here. So now we need one more label, which is basically this. And we are going to say active scanning frequency max as a label. And that label's text is going to be set to active scanning frequency dot high value, which we just set up there. The other thing we could do is just run the active selection scanning frequency infrastructure value as a string. And now we have I believe this is everything. We will now have the scanning value, researchable, or we now have the scanning value investable. And because it's investable, we'll have an accurate update of the values. So let's test it and see. And so on selection, we can invest in all this, and they show up properly. So if I want to max it out, it's not going to become easy. And if I say the scan range invest and the scan frequency invest, oh, it is affecting them. Okay, good. So I wasn't sure if it was going to reset these properly or not, but it is actually resetting them properly. So now the frequency is at 10 or 11. We can leave that be. And now the investment is going all the way up into scan range. And we just happen to know that we can do an AoE scan to max our range at a low frequency. But we still can't afford it, so I guess we can play around and invest in our economy. And this will eventually afford us the ability to do our AoE scan. Even though we did the backwards, it might have been better to invest in economy first. But effectively, the player could do something like this. It's going to take forever, but the other thing the player could do is lower the radius pretty hard on the arc, and they could just do a long scan at 180 or at 120 and chop it into halves or thirds, basically. And that one, you can run the scan, and then you just run the arc to the other side and run another scan, and then run another scan over here. I'm still tanking up the econ, so I'm going to clear it at 70. And that's plus and 70 per tick. And actually, I wound up finding all three of the selections. Okay, so real quick, if I select this, they'll turn off, and that's correct. And this all worked properly. So I'm going to try to jack up the radius again. Now it's got enough. Let me make sure. Okay, so now we can just do an AoE scan. And so that's a bug. So if I change the scan range within, go back up, I'll have 2K left if I scan. So if I run the scan, it should immediately say that 1125 number to signify how much I'll have left if I do another scan. That way I can see this is now 279 if I scan. Oh, that time it kind of worked. And now I see that I just can't afford it. Or whatever. Alright, so that's basically set up except for that little bug with the scan. Actually, out of curiosity, if I close this and deselect and then open it, okay, and if I close it and select this and then open it, they do show up. And if I invest in these and close this, it says it's still working. And if I deselect it and open it, it says nothing. But if I reselect this guy, it should be investing still, and it will say the proper values. Okay, good. So that's basically correct. Alright, so the infrastructure makes sense. It's investing properly, and it has the proper deficit value. There's just that one itsy bitsy little bug where sometimes when I scan, it doesn't immediately update to the next calculation, which I kind of feel like fixing because it denies the player feedback that they're interested in, which is how much can this new scan that's sitting here be run for. So I'm going to have to take a look at that. So that's under active scanning elements. And that is our launch scan button. And there's nothing I need to fix here also. Although I'm actually not sure how to. Probably have to say default. And new scan color dot r equals 1f. New scan color dot g equals 1f. New scan color dot b equals 1f. And this will make anything above that value white. So it's just white beyond like frequency 8 or 9. is more or less the plan for that one. In the event the button is pressed, it does in fact need to check. If the total economy is less than total cost of active scan. So basically, we're going to want this also. If the player data is greater than 0 here, I'll just say greater than or equal to 0. Then launch scan should be set to true. Player data displayed total economy equals player data total economy minus player data total cost of active scan. So I'm wondering why displayed total economy. Oh no, that makes sense. So yeah, displayed total economy is essentially this. And then the economy tally looks like that, except for when it's greater than or equal to 0, I'm just going to make it white. And maybe switch it to green, but we'll see. So actually, this might be just enough to fix that bug. Give it a smidgen for compilation. And now we're back over here. Give it one more run here. Let's just select the planet and start investing into the economy to gain some ticks. And the idea is to run a 360 scan at a high range. And if I spend just enough money like this, the idea is that it will properly update. So if I click this, okay, so that's more accurate. So even if I drag this down, if I click scan, okay, so that makes sense. And now I'll clear on this investment since it's dragged it pretty high. And then buff the scanning range. Run a scan and see that I could do another scan at an even higher value if necessary. And that's essentially how it works. But oh no, I didn't invest in frequency. It's not even a 41 range scan, but it is so expensive. Jeez. I guess that has to do with the area of a circle. Yeah, I mean, so if God forbid you're trying to do it with a frequency, have a maximum or something, you're looking at having to drop the area of the angle down really far, and even then, like, your economy has to be pretty big to pull off something like this. So shooting a scan like this into interstellar space, like, that was a super expensive scan. So yeah, I'm not sure. The frequency is not that big of a deal at this point. The range is just so high. To do an AoE scan, it's almost impractical. It would come down to your economy for sure. So in that instance, I was able to get my economy 10 times higher. It pays off itself pretty quickly, but might need a little bit more balancing. Perhaps make it cost a little bit more for every point to get that point is essentially the idea I've got. So effectively it would start to sink your deficit harder. And it would just cost more to get more economy over time. That's the best idea I've got for this. So, alright, so that's basically working then. The scanner's working correctly. The investments are working correctly. And the finding new things is opening correctly. I just have to actually make them spawn with stuff on them properly. Alright, so let me double check which hour I'm on here. What is this, hour 5? So day 6, hour 5. The game is slowly coming together. It's got some decent mechanics, a lot of room for growth. I've got to do a lot more stuff to get the game to a very viable position, but the game is coming together, as we've seen from this. So if you are still excited in what this game has to offer, I would really appreciate it if you could throw me a few bucks on Patreon. That is the thing I need the most right now to help out with this. And I'll be able to focus even harder on getting everything done for this game. So if you're up for it, that'd really be awesome. But until then, I will see you in the next video, so take care.